Imagine a place where the air itself actively tries to kill you. A land where temperatures drop so brutally low, the moisture in your breath freezes before it even hits the snow. This is Alaska. We are not talking about some peaceful winter wonderland here. This is an absolute frozen hell for the creatures trapped inside its borders. Winter here does not just bring the cold, it brings pure desperation. When the rivers freeze solid and those endless dark nights take over, the landscape changes. Ancient rivalries get pushed to the absolute breaking point. There is nowhere to hide out here. There is zero escape. Massive grizzly bears, ruthless wolf packs, and tough-as-nails wolverines are forced into a brutal game of survival against giant moose and migrating caribou. You have to understand that every single day becomes a violent struggle just to find a few calories. One wrong step, one missed hunt, and the ice simply claims another victim. The margin for error is zero. This is the ultimate test of endurance, and only the absolute toughest are going to see the spring. Alaska does not care if you are the biggest, fastest, or smartest animal on the mountain. When the temperature drops completely off the charts, the rules of the game change in an instant. You are looking at a landscape that stretches for hundreds of thousands of square miles in every direction. It is a blinding white ocean of snow, jagged rock, and solid ice. The animals stuck out here do not just try to survive the cold, they wage an absolute, desperate war against it every single day. Think about the grizzly bear for a second. Most people picture them standing in a rushing river, lazily fishing for salmon in the warm summer sun. But when the deep freeze sets in, a grizzly turns into a massive walking furnace that is rapidly running out of fuel. They tip the scales at over 800 pounds, and every single ounce of that fat was earned through sheer, relentless gluttony. Now they are burning it just to keep their massive hearts beating in the dark. Out on the wide open tundra, the caribou herds are already on the move. From a distance, they look like thousands of dark ghosts drifting silently through the freezing fog. A caribou is custom built for this frozen hell. Their hooves are basically biological snowshoes, incredibly wide and razor-sharp on the edges. They are perfectly designed to crack right through the thick, icy crust to reach the pathetic little scraps of lichen buried deep underneath. It is definitely not much of a meal for an animal that size, but when you are starving out in the harsh Alaskan interior, you take exactly what you can get without hesitation. And the brutal reality is that they are never, ever alone. You simply cannot have a massive, moving herd of prey without attracting the kind of attention that eventually gets you killed. The predators in this valley know exactly where the herds are heading, and they have all the time in the world to wait. It becomes a slow, agonizing march across a landscape that offers zero physical protection from the howling wind. Then, deeper in the timber, you have the moose. These guys are basically walking tanks equipped with heavy artillery on their heads. A full-grown bull moose can weigh well over 1,000 pounds and stand 7 feet tall right at the shoulder. They do not bother running from the cold because there is nowhere to go. They just stand there in the deep powder, using those absurdly long legs to easily wade through snowdrifts that would bury a human alive in minutes. But even a massive moose feels the painful bite of the Alaskan winter deep in its bones. Their bodies are working in absolute overdrive, and they need immense amounts of frozen twigs and bark just to maintain their internal temperature. The entire forest goes dead silent, but it is definitely not peaceful. It is the heavy silence of thousands of animals holding their breath, trying desperately not to burn a single calorie they don't have to. Every movement is carefully calculated. Every step could be the exact one that drains the last bit of vital energy they have left to give. Survival in the deep snow is entirely about managing your energy. If you burn too much too fast, you die. It really is that simple. And nobody understands this deadly mathematical equation better than a pack of gray wolves. These are not just wild dogs running around in the woods. They are highly coordinated, tactical units that operate with terrifying efficiency. A wolf pack in Alaska might control a territory the size of a small European country. They patrol constantly, leaving a network of tracks through the frozen wilderness, searching for any sign of weakness in the local population. When they finally lock onto the scent of a moose, the entire dynamic of the forest shifts. The wolves do not just charge in blindly like amateurs. They analyze the situation. They spread out, communicating through subtle body language, and they test the giant. They want to see if the moose is going to run, because if it runs, they automatically win. Deep snow exhausts a running moose incredibly fast, turning a massive tank into a helpless, stumbling target. But a smart, healthy moose knows exactly what is at stake. When the pack closes the distance, the moose backs itself up against thick timber or a steep rock wall to protect its blind spots. It stands its ground and prepares for war. This is where the Alaskan wilderness gets incredibly brutal. The wolves dart in, snapping their jaws, trying to provoke a reaction, trying to make the giant turn and expose its vulnerable flanks. But the moose lashes out with its front hooves. One solid strike from a hoof that heavy can shatter a wolf's skull instantly or break its spine in half. It becomes an agonizing standoff of pure endurance and nerve. The wolves are starving, and the moose is fighting for its absolute life. Hours can pass like this in the freezing cold. The pack will literally take shifts, lying down in the snow to rest, while others continue to harass the giant, relentlessly chipping away at its physical and mental stamina. This is not the clean, quick kill you see in heavily edited wildlife clips. It is a messy, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous process for everyone involved. If the moose makes one single mistake, if it trips in the deep snow or turns its head at the wrong second, the pack swarms. They target the massive hind legs, dragging the titan down through sheer numbers and overwhelming pain. But if the moose holds its ground, refusing to break, the wolves will eventually do the math. They will realize the risk of severe injury is just too high, and they will slowly pull back, fading into the tree line to look for an easier meal. The moose survives another day, heavily breathing cold air into its burning lungs. It is a victory, but out here, victory just means you get to wake up tomorrow and fight the exact same war all over again. When a kill does happen in this frozen environment, it never stays a secret for long. The Alaskan wilderness has a very efficient cleanup crew, and they are always watching from above. The bald eagle is an absolute master of scanning the deep valleys and frozen rivers. They sit perfectly still in the highest branches of ancient pine trees, acting like silent sentinels over the white expanse. With eyesight that is roughly 4 to 8 times stronger than ours, they can spot a blood trail or a fresh carcass from miles away. They are usually the first ones on the scene after a wolf pack moves on. An eagle might look majestic on a national emblem, but out here, they are completely ruthless scavengers. They will tear at frozen meat with those incredibly sharp, curved beaks, gulping down whatever they can before the real heavyweights arrive. And trust me, the heavyweights are always coming. The smell of raw meat acts like a dinner bell that echoes across miles of frozen terrain. Suddenly, the eagles scatter, flapping their massive wings to get off the ground quickly. They know exactly what is approaching through the thick brush. Enter the Wolverine. Pound for pound, this might be the most aggressive, fearless animal in all of North America. They look like a strange mix between a small bear and a dog, but they possess the pure, unhinged attitude of a cornered badger. A wolverine only weighs about 40 pounds, but it honestly acts like it weighs 1,000. They are solitary wanderers, built perfectly for navigating deep, powdery snow, and they are always hungry. When a wolverine claims a carcass, it does not care who is watching. It will bare its teeth, let out a terrifying guttural growl, and aggressively defend its prize against animals 5 times its size. They have even been known to drive young grizzly bears and entire wolf packs away from a kill just through pure, concentrated aggression and sheer psychotic confidence. The wolverine has a very special set of tools for this exact scenario. Their jaws are incredibly powerful, and their molars are rotated in a specific way that allows them to crack open solid frozen bones to reach the nutritious marrow inside. While the eagles and ravens can only pick at the soft tissue left on the outside, the wolverine processes the entire skeleton. They leave absolutely nothing to waste. This dynamic is exactly what keeps the Alaskan ecosystem running during the darkest months. The wolves make the kill, the eagles take their quick tacks, and the wolverine cleans up the rest, returning those vital, hard-earned calories back into the harsh environment. It is a perfectly balanced system of death and recycling, heavily reliant on the brutal fact that someone else had to lose their life today so these scavengers could survive the endless freeze. There is a massive, relentless rhythm to life up here, and nothing captures that pulse better than the great caribou migration. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of animals moving across the continent in one of the most incredible journeys on the entire planet. They are driven by ancient instincts, pushing through blinding snowstorms and crossing treacherous, half-frozen rivers to reach their distant calving grounds. It is a spectacle of pure endurance. When you stand on a ridge and look down into the valley, the herd stretches out as far as the eye can see, a massive, moving river of brown fur and sharp antlers against the blinding white snow. But this epic journey is absolutely loaded with danger. The caribou are essentially dragging a massive buffet line right through the home territories of every major predator in Alaska. The wolves do not just follow the herd, they pace them. They walk parallel to the Great Migration, constantly scanning the masses for a limp, a stumble, or a calf that strays just a little too far from its mother. The absolute worst part of the journey is the river crossings. The water is freezing, loaded with dangerous ice chunks and moving fast. The caribou have hollow hair that helps them float, but they still have to fight the crushing current. This is a moment of pure vulnerability. Grizzly bears, who are normally solitary and territorial, will actually gather near these crossing points. They know the rivers act as a natural bottleneck. A massive grizzly will simply wait on the muddy banks, watching the chaotic flood of animals trying to scramble out of the freezing water. When the bears strike, it is explosive and violent. They use their incredible raw power to pull exhausted caribou right back down into the mud. It is complete chaos. The herd panics, slipping on the wet rocks, trampling over each other in a desperate scramble to reach the safety of the open tundra. Not everyone makes it across. The weak, the old, and the exhausted are inevitably left behind to feed the riverbanks. But the herd cannot stop to mourn. They cannot afford to pause for even a single day. They are racing against the changing seasons, driven by a biological timer that demands they keep moving forward, no matter the cost. The predators gorge themselves, building up the vital layers of fat they will desperately need for the coming months. The Great Migration forces the entire ecosystem to interact in a massive, brutal display of life and death. The caribou provide the heavy fuel that keeps the wolves hunting, the bears strong, and the ravens fed. Without this incredible, agonizing journey, the entire predator population of the Alaskan interior would completely collapse. Eventually, the real winter arrives. This is not just cold weather. This is the deep, dark freeze, where the sun barely climbs above the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the ice. The temperature plummets to 50 degrees below zero, and the wind simply howls through the empty canyons. Most of the wildlife has either migrated south, died, or gone to sleep. But a few stubborn holdouts are still out here, walking the frozen edge of survival. Some grizzly bears stay up incredibly late into the season. Usually, it is the big males who fail to secure enough calories during the brief summer window. They become desperate, wandering the dark forests like giant, hungry ghosts. They use their massive claws to rip apart rotten logs, hoping to find a few frozen grubs, or they follow the faint scent of old death on the freezing wind. Every single hour they spend out of the den is a massive gamble. The cold is aggressively sucking the life right out of their bones, and if they don't find shelter soon, they will simply freeze to death exactly where they stand. But while the massive bears struggle with the encroaching darkness, this exact environment is where the wolverine truly thrives. This is their kingdom. While the rest of the world shuts down in sheer terror of the cold, the wolverine is patrolling a territory that can span hundreds of miles. They do not hibernate. They do not migrate. They just lower their heads and push through the massive snowdrifts with absolute mechanical determination. They have incredibly dense, frost-resistant fur that keeps them completely insulated, and their wide paws act like built-in snowshoes. They are searching for the victims of the harsh winter. An avalanche that buried a mountain goat, or a moose that finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. The wolverine will find it all. They can smell a frozen carcass buried under 20 feet of solid snow. And once they find it, they will start digging like absolute maniacs. It is a wildly lonely existence. A wolverine might go weeks without seeing another living creature, moving entirely alone under the brilliant dancing lights of the aurora borealis. But they do not care. They are completely self-reliant, fueled by an aggressive will to live that is unmatched by anything else in North America. As the longest nights of the year settle over the landscape, the contrast is stark. You have massive giants like the Grizzly retreating into the dark earth to hide, and tough, relentless scavengers like the Wolverine marching out boldly into the storm. This frozen wasteland demands absolute perfection from the animals that stay. There is no room for mistakes, no mercy for the weak, and only the absolute toughest survivors will be standing when the ice finally begins to melt. While the frozen valleys below are locked in a brutal daily struggle, the mountain peaks of the Alaskan range offer a completely different kind of nightmare. These mountains cut through the sky like a row of jagged, freezing teeth. Up here, the winter wind does not just blow, it actively screams. It howls across the exposed rock at over 100 miles an hour, carrying tiny shards of ice that can literally cut your skin open. But strangely enough, this terrifying wind is exactly what keeps the Dall sheep alive. By violently blasting the deep snow off the highest ridges, the weather exposes tiny, frozen patches of dried alpine grass. It is terrible, low-calorie food, but it is still food. These pure white sheep are absolute masters of high-altitude survival, living their entire lives on cliffs so steep that looking down would make a normal creature sick. You really have to look closely at their hooves to understand how they survive. They are a biological miracle of engineering. The hooves have incredibly hard outer edges for digging straight into solid ice and a soft, spongy center that grips bare rock just like a professional climbing shoe. They can run at a full sprint across ledges that are barely 2 inches wide. But they do not hang out on these terrifying cliffs for the incredible views. They are forced up here because it is the absolute only way to avoid the wolf packs patrolling the tree line below. The wolves simply cannot follow them up into this vertical world. One slip means a fatal drop of 1,000 feet, and a wolf's soft paws are definitely not built for technical rock climbing. So, the sheep willingly trade the massive danger of ground predators for the constant, extreme danger of gravity. But in the Alaskan wilderness, you never truly escape danger. You just end up trading one killer for another. The real threat on these peaks does not come from below, it comes from the freezing sky. The golden eagle is the undisputed, aggressive king of these mountains. They ride the violent thermal drafts with massive wingspans stretching over 7 feet across. An eagle does not care about the steep cliffs or the icy, slippery ledges. They use the heavy wind to hang perfectly still in the freezing air, silently scanning the sheep herds for any sign of a newborn lamb or a weak, injured adult. When they finally spot a target, they do not just swoop down peacefully. They tuck their heavy wings and dive like a biological missile, reaching speeds of over 150 miles an hour. They hit their prey with heavy talons that can exert bone-crushing pressure, often trying to literally knock the terrified animal right off the side of the mountain. If the eagle succeeds, gravity simply does all the dirty work. It is a brutal, shockingly fast execution on the rocks below. The entire sheep herd instantly panics, scrambling even higher into the absolute most dangerous terrain they can find, just to get some cover. Deep beneath the rocks they are standing on, hoary marmots are buried in a state of extreme hibernation, completely frozen and waiting for spring. But the sheep do not have that luxury. They must constantly balance their desperate need to eat the exposed grass with their absolute need to stay near the steepest, most vertical escape routes. They are trapped entirely between the freezing sky and the deadly drop below, living every single day on a razor-thin edge. If you drop down from the brutal mountain peaks and enter the dense, snow-covered boreal forest, the entire world instantly goes quiet. The heavy timber blocks out the screaming wind, creating a muffled, eerie silence that stretches for millions of acres. This is the taiga. It looks peaceful, almost like a perfect postcard, but do not let the quiet fool you. This forest is a massive, heavily contested battleground designed for pure stealth. Out here, every single sound you make can easily cost you your life. This is the kingdom of the Canadian lynx and the snowshoe hare. These two species are locked in an ancient evolutionary arms race that is so intense, their entire populations actually rise and fall together in a perfect 10-year biological cycle. Let's look at the hare first. In the summer, they are brown and blend into the dirt, but right now, in the dead of winter, they are wearing a coat of pure, brilliant white. They are practically invisible against the deep snowbanks. Their name comes from their massive, absurdly oversized back feet, which are heavily covered in thick fur. These feet act exactly like high-tech snowshoes, allowing them to bounce lightly over powder that is easily 10 feet deep. They sit perfectly still under the frozen pine branches, literally freezing their bodies into statues. They know that moving creates a shadow, and a shadow draws death. Their massive ears act like radar dishes, constantly rotating, listening for the absolute faintest crunch of snow in the dark woods. Because somewhere out there, the lynx is already hunting. The Canadian lynx is the ultimate ghost of the North. They look like heavily modified house cats, with massive, thickly padded paws that are actually larger than a mountain lion's feet. This allows a heavy predator to walk entirely on top of the deep snow without sinking an inch. They do not chase their prey over long distances like a wolf. A lynx operates purely on patience and explosive ambush tactics. They will crouch behind a frozen stump for literally hours, completely ignoring the freezing cold, just waiting for a hare to hop within striking distance. When the moment is right, the lynx explodes forward in a blur of gray fur. It is a terrifying display of vertical leaps and razor-sharp claws. The hare erupts into a frantic, chaotic sprint, darting left and right through the dense trees, trying desperately to break the predator's line of sight. But the ground is not the only place you have to watch out for in the dark taiga. While this intense foot race is happening, a great horned owl is sitting high up in the heavy timber. These massive birds have feathers with specialized, serrated edges that completely muffle the sound of the air passing over their wings. They fly in absolute, perfect silence. If the hare manages to dodge the lynx and sprints out into a small, open clearing, the owl simply drops from the sky like a shadow. It is a brutal crossfire. In this quiet, frozen forest, you are either a completely silent killer or you are somebody else's dinner. If you push even further north, past the protective cover of the boreal forest, you hit the absolute end of the world. This is the open tundra. It is a flat, frozen desert of permafrost where the environment is so incredibly hostile that trees physically cannot grow. The wind here blasts uninterrupted for hundreds of miles, creating a landscape that honestly looks like the surface of a dead planet. To survive out here in the open, you cannot just adapt to the cold. You have to be ancient. You have to be built like a prehistoric tank. Meet the muskox. These massive, shaggy beasts look like they literally just walked out of the last ice age. And honestly, they basically did. They shared this exact same frozen dirt with woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, and they are still here, standing entirely unfazed by the brutal Alaskan winter. A full-grown muskox is wrapped in a dual-layer coat that is completely impervious to the freezing wind. The outer layer consists of guard hairs that can be 2 feet long, dragging on the snow like a heavy skirt. Underneath that is a dense layer of underwool called kiviut, which is supposedly 8 times warmer than normal sheep's wool. They do not bother looking for shelter during a blinding whiteout blizzard. They just stand their ground, lower their massive, heavily armored heads, and let the storm rage right over them. They use their front hooves to smash through the rock-hard ice crust, chewing on microscopic bits of frozen moss. But out in this endless, white void, a dark shape is always moving on the horizon: the Arctic wolf. Arctic wolves are entirely different from the gray wolves in the forest below. They are pure white, heavily muscled, and completely adapted to hunting in a barren wasteland where prey is insanely scarce. A pack will easily travel over 2,000 miles in a single winter just looking for something to kill. When they finally locate a small herd of muskoxen, the tactical game begins. The wolves cannot just charge in. A charging muskox would easily crush a wolf's skull with its heavy helmet-like horns. Instead, when the muskoxen realize they are under attack, they perform one of the most incredible defensive maneuvers in all of nature. They physically slam their bodies together, forming a tight, impenetrable circle of heavy horns and muscle, putting all of their vulnerable calves dead in the center. It becomes an ancient, terrifying siege. The white wolves circle the heavy fortress of horns, probing for any sign of weakness. They will deliberately try to spook the herd, aggressively barking and making sudden lunges, desperately hoping that one young muskox panics and breaks the formation. If the circle holds, the muskoxen are basically invincible. The wolves will eventually realize they are wasting precious energy and will fade back into the whiteout. But if just one animal loses its nerve and runs, the circle immediately shatters. The wolves will ruthlessly isolate the runner, dragging it down into the freezing dirt. Out on this barren tundra, survival is entirely about holding the line together, because the second you step out on your own, the winter swallows you whole. Up above the surface, the Alaskan winter is a screaming, freezing nightmare of snow and wind. But if you look closely at the frozen rivers and massive ponds, you will find a hidden, completely alien world locked safely beneath the ice. While the grizzly bears are starving and the caribou are marching to their deaths, a very specific group of animals has engineered a brilliant escape route. They do not fight the cold on the surface. They completely bypass it by living underneath a massive ceiling of solid, protective ice. This is the realm of the beaver. Back in the frantic days of late autumn, the beavers were working on pure, desperate overdrive. They aggressively chewed down hundreds of trees, dragging heavy branches into the freezing mud to build their massive, dome-shaped lodges. Now the water is completely frozen over, turning that mud and wood into a structure that is literally as hard as concrete. No wolf or bear is getting through that roof. Inside the lodge, it is dark, incredibly humid, and actually quite warm just from the collective body heat of the beaver family. When a beaver gets hungry, it simply slips down through a hidden underwater tunnel directly into the freezing river. The ice above them acts like a massive thermal blanket, keeping the deep water at a constant, manageable temperature just above freezing. The beavers had already pinned a massive pile of fresh branches to the river bottom before the big freeze. They just swim down into the dark, grab a piece of wood, and bring it back up to the lodge to safely eat their frozen dinner. But this dark underwater sanctuary is absolutely not entirely safe. It has its own dedicated, highly specialized killers. Enter the North American river otter. While the beavers are just trying to peacefully eat tree bark, the otter is an aquatic missile heavily armed with sharp teeth. Otters do not build their own houses. They are relentless, aggressive nomads that travel for miles completely under the ice, breathing from tiny, hidden air pockets trapped against the frozen surface. They are perfectly streamlined, using their heavy tails to propel themselves through the murky, freezing water at terrifying speeds. They hunt fish, frogs, and anything else they can get their claws on. An otter is bold enough to actually invade a beaver's lodge if it finds the entrance. It is a terrifying home invasion in absolute darkness. The heavy, sluggish beaver has to aggressively defend its family in a tight, enclosed space against a predator that is fast, agile, and incredibly vicious. And patrolling the icy banks just above them is the mink, a small, dark hunter that constantly slinks through the cracks in the ice, snatching up whatever scraps the otters leave behind. The surface world might look completely dead and locked in white ice, but this dark, claustrophobic world beneath the freezing water is constantly pulsing with violent, aggressive life. It is just playing by a completely different set of rules. Eventually, the frozen rivers empty out, the mainland ends, and you reach the most brutal edge of the North American continent. This is the northern coastline of Alaska, where the frozen tundra physically smashes into the freezing waters of the Arctic Ocean. For a few short months in the summer, this water is completely open. But when the deep winter freeze finally hits, the ocean itself literally begins to harden. This is the birth of the pack ice. It is a chaotic, grinding, constantly shifting mass of frozen saltwater that creates a temporary, deeply dangerous continent. And the exact moment the ice is thick enough to hold weight, the true, undisputed king of the North walks out of the heavy fog, the polar bear. You have to forget everything you know about brown bears and grizzlies. A fully grown male polar bear is a massive, highly specialized marine mammal. They can weigh well over 1,500 pounds, making them the largest land predators on the entire planet. They do not hibernate, and they certainly do not eat berries. They are pure, hyper-carnivorous killing machines, built entirely for one highly specific task: hunting on the shifting sea ice. Their massive, heavily padded paws act like giant snowshoes, heavily distributing their weight so they do not crash through the thin ice. They slowly roam this vast, freezing white desert completely alone, using a sense of smell that is so incredibly powerful they can detect a seal hidden deep under 3 feet of solid ice from over a mile away. The hunting tactics of a polar bear require a terrifying amount of patience. When they locate a seal's hidden breathing hole in the ice, they do not dig, they just wait. They will sit perfectly still in the freezing, howling wind for literally hours, just staring at that small crack in the ice. The exact second the seal pops its head up to take a quick breath, the bear strikes with explosive, massive power. It uses its heavy front claws to grab the terrified seal and physically drag it straight up through the tiny, jagged hole in the ice, crushing its skull instantly. It is a display of raw, terrifying strength that absolutely nothing else on Earth can match. But the polar bear is almost never truly alone out there on the ice. Following at a very safe, respectful distance is the Arctic fox. These tiny, pure white scavengers are the ultimate opportunists of the deep freeze. They literally shadow the massive bears for hundreds of miles, surviving entirely on the bloody scraps of blubber and meat left behind after a seal kill. The foxes have to be incredibly careful because a hungry polar bear will absolutely kill and eat them without a second thought. Further out, where the ice meets the dark, open water, massive walruses haul their heavy bodies onto the floes, watching the bears with highly aggressive caution. Here at the absolute edge of the continent, the ice is not just weather. The ice is the entire platform for life. It is the hunting ground, the dining room, and the battlefield all rolled into one freezing, unforgiving landscape. Most people look at a massive, unbroken field of Alaskan snow and see absolute death. It looks like a barren, frozen wasteland where nothing could possibly survive. But if you could somehow peel back that thick layer of white, you would find an entire hidden metropolis. We call this the subnivean zone. It is a complex network of tiny tunnels and caverns carved directly out of the snowpack. Down here, the temperature stays just around freezing, which is actually a massive relief when the air above is 50 below zero. This dark, claustrophobic world is completely ruled by lemmings and voles. These tiny rodents do not hibernate at all. They spend the entire winter aggressively chewing through frozen roots, seeds, and dead grass buried under the snow. They are basically the foundation of the entire Arctic food web. Every single predator out here is absolutely obsessed with finding them. But living under the snow does not mean you are safe. It just means you are hiding in a very confined space. Enter the ermine. This is a type of weasel that turns completely, blindingly white in the winter, except for a tiny black tip on its tail. An ermine is an absolute nightmare for a lemming. They have these incredibly long, slender bodies that look almost like a furry snake. This unique shape allows the ermine to easily slip right into the lemming tunnels. It is a terrifying home invasion in absolute darkness. The lemmings have nowhere to run when a predator can literally navigate their own custom-built escape routes. The ermine hunts with a frantic, high-speed energy, moving through the subnivean maze like a heat-seeking missile until it completely corners its prey. And the danger does not just come from inside the tunnels. Up above, sitting perfectly still on a frosted fence post or a stunted tree, is the snowy owl. This bird is an absolute phantom of the tundra. They have incredibly thick feathers covering everything down to their toes, making them perfectly insulated against the screaming wind. But their real superpower is their hearing. A snowy owl can literally hear the faint scratching of a single lemming moving under 2 feet of packed snow. When they lock onto that sound, they launch themselves into the air with silent, ghost-like wing beats. They hover for a split second, calculate the exact trajectory, and then plunge completely headfirst into the deep powder. They punch through the hard, icy crust with their heavy talons, completely collapsing the tunnel and snatching the unseen rodent right out of the dark. It is a brutal, three-dimensional war happening entirely out of sight. The lemmings are just trying to find enough frozen seeds to keep their tiny hearts beating. The ermine is relentlessly hunting them through a claustrophobic maze of ice, and the snowy owl is launching surgical airstrikes from the freezing sky. This complex hidden ecosystem is incredibly delicate. If the snowpack is too thin, the subnivean zone never forms, and the rodents simply freeze to death. If it gets too thick, the owls cannot punch through to reach their prey. Every single aspect of this frozen war is entirely dependent on the chaotic, unpredictable weather of the Alaskan winter. Survival here is a constant, terrifying gamble for everyone involved. The Alaskan coastline in the dead of winter is one of the most desolate, unforgiving places on Earth. When the ocean itself turns into a grinding, shifting mass of sea ice, the normal rules of coastal survival completely fall apart. The beaches are buried under massive, jagged blocks of blue ice that have been violently smashed ashore by brutal winter storms. Most of the summer seabirds have long since abandoned this frozen hell, flying thousands of miles south to find open water. But a few incredibly tough scavengers refuse to leave. The glaucous gull is one of them. These are massive, aggressive birds that look like loud ghosts haunting the shoreline. They do not care about the cold. They only care about calories, and they will stubbornly patrol the freezing edge of the ice pack every single day. They are not looking for fish. The ocean is locked away under several feet of solid ice. Instead, they are looking for absolute tragedy. A walrus that did not survive the freezing night, or maybe the bloody scraps left behind by a roaming polar bear. Out here, one animal's death is the absolute only way another animal gets to live. And the gulls are never the only ones looking for a free meal. The common raven is easily the smartest survivor on this frozen coast. Ravens are absolute geniuses of the animal kingdom. They do not have massive talons or flesh-tearing beaks, but they have incredibly complex brains. They actively follow the large predators, knowing exactly what a wolf or a bear is capable of doing. A raven will literally sit on a freezing rock for hours, patiently watching a bear hunt, just waiting for the scraps. But securing the meat is only half the battle. Down on the frozen beach, a red fox is frantically digging at the frozen remains of a seal. The fox looks completely out of place here. Its bright orange fur is an absolute beacon against the blinding white ice. It has to move fast, ripping off tiny pieces of frozen fat before something bigger and meaner shows up. Suddenly, a pair of ravens drop out of the freezing sky. They do not attack the fox directly. They use psychological warfare. One raven will land right in front of the fox, aggressively hopping around and screaming, completely distracting the mammal. The second raven sneaks up from behind, snatches a massive piece of fat, and immediately takes off. It is a highly coordinated, incredibly frustrating heist that leaves the fox digging in the empty snow. This is life on the frozen edge. There is absolutely no honor out here, and there is no fair play. It is a brutal economy based entirely on scavenging, stealing, and outsmarting your rivals. The cold does not just kill you, it actively preserves the dead, turning the coastline into a massive frozen grocery store for those tough enough to endure the wind. The foxes, the gulls, and the ravens are all locked in a miserable, freezing standoff. They spend weeks on end just walking the jagged ice, listening to the ocean grind and crack, desperately waiting for the very first signs of a spring thaw that always feels like it is a million years away. Deep inside the massive, snow-choked boreal forest, the true struggle for survival happens long after the sun goes down. During the brief, pathetic daylight hours, the taiga looks completely dead and empty. But when absolute darkness swallows the heavy timber, a completely different cast of characters finally wakes up. High up in the frozen branches, moving with an incredibly slow, deliberate clumsiness, is the North American porcupine. These guys are practically walking tanks covered in over 30,000 razor-sharp quills. They do not care about being stealthy, and they honestly do not care about the freezing temperatures. A porcupine will just sit in a single spruce tree for days at a time, aggressively stripping off the bitter, frozen bark. Eating frozen tree bark is a terrible way to get calories. It takes massive amounts of internal energy just to digest the rough, freezing wood. But the porcupine has a massive digestive tract designed specifically to ferment and break down exactly this kind of garbage food. They are practically invincible to most predators, so they just take their sweet time. But right below them, the quiet canopy is suddenly violently interrupted. A northern flying squirrel launches itself from a dead pine tree, spreading its limbs wide to catch the freezing air. It does not actually fly, but it glides like a biological parachute, silently crossing massive gaps in the forest canopy. They have these huge, alien-like black eyes that pull in every single tiny drop of moonlight, allowing them to navigate the dark, tangled branches at breakneck speeds. The flying squirrel is frantically searching for frozen fungi and old seeds hidden deep in the bark crevices. But gliding through the open air makes them incredibly vulnerable. The American marten is watching. This is a ferocious, heavily muscled predator that looks incredibly cute but has the violent attitude of a wolverine. The marten is completely adapted to the vertical world. It does not wait on the ground. It chases the squirrel straight through the heavy canopy. The marten has semi-retractable claws that allow it to sprint up the sides of massive frozen trees and leap frantically from branch to branch. It is a high-speed, terrifying parkour chase happening 50 feet above the dark, frozen ground. If the squirrel misses a jump or miscalculates a glide, the marten closes the gap in an absolute blur of teeth and claws. It is a sudden, quiet execution in the dark branches. And immediately, the forest returns to that heavy, dead silence. The porcupine just keeps chewing its frozen bark, completely ignoring the murder that just happened 10 feet away. This nocturnal world is heavily segregated. The ground is buried in dangerous, deep powder, forcing these animals to live their entire violent lives high up in the freezing, swaying architecture of the ancient taiga trees. We have talked a lot about the warm-blooded animals, the bears, the wolves, the birds. They fight the cold with heavy fur, thick fat layers, or by simply running away. But what about the animals that cannot produce their own body heat? How does a cold-blooded creature survive when the very dirt they sleep in freezes solid as concrete? The answer is one of the most terrifying and incredible biological miracles on Earth. They do not fight the ice. They literally let the ice win. Deep under the leaf litter, locked completely in the frozen mud, is the wood frog. If you dug one up right now, you would swear it was a tiny, dead piece of green stone. It does not have a heartbeat. It is not breathing. Its blood has completely stopped flowing, and its eyes are completely frozen over with a milky white layer of solid ice. By all normal medical definitions, this animal is totally dead, but it is just waiting. When the first hard freeze hits the forest floor, the wood frog's liver immediately kicks into massive overdrive. It floods the frog's entire bloodstream with incredibly high levels of glucose. This biological sugar acts exactly like the heavy antifreeze you put in a car engine. It forces the ice crystals to form exclusively in the empty spaces around the frog's internal organs, preventing the vital cells from violently rupturing and destroying the delicate tissue. The frog will spend months in this bizarre, suspended state of frozen animation, and it is not the only one completely cheating death. Out on the open, wind-blasted tundra, the Arctic woolly bear caterpillar is doing something even more extreme. This tiny insect takes almost 14 years to fully develop into a moth because the summer is simply too short for it to eat enough food. So, every single winter, it just completely stops. It curls up in a tiny ball and lets its entire body freeze completely solid. It spends over 90% of its long life frozen like a rock, violently battered by 50 below zero winds. Its tiny heart stops entirely. It is a biological pause button that defies all logic. These incredible, tiny survivors completely flip the script on the Alaskan winter. They do not run, they do not hide, and they do not struggle. They completely surrender their bodies to the freezing temperatures, essentially dying for the entire season just so they can miraculously reboot their organs when the sun finally returns. It proves that life out here does not just exist in spite of the brutal cold. In some incredibly weird, deeply specialized cases, life has actually learned to completely weaponize the freezing process to its own incredible advantage. There is a specific point in the Alaskan winter when the novelty of the snow completely wears off, and absolute, grinding desperation takes over. It is late February. The days are finally starting to get a little bit longer, but the temperatures are still insanely brutal. This is absolutely the hardest part of the year. The massive fat reserves built up during the summer are completely gone. Every single animal out here is running on absolute fumes. The prey is incredibly weak, which sounds like great news for the predators, but it is actually a massive trap. The wolves are starving just as badly as the animals they are desperately trying to hunt. A gray wolf pack looks completely different now than it did back in November. Their ribs are showing clearly through their thick winter coats. They move slower, heavily conserving every single precious drop of energy. They know that hunting right now is incredibly dangerous. They cannot afford to get injured because a broken leg in February is an automatic, agonizing death sentence. They finally track down a massive bull moose in a deep, snow-filled ravine. The moose is in terrible shape. It has lost hundreds of pounds, and its massive antlers have already fallen off. But sheer desperation makes a giant animal completely unpredictable and wildly violent. When you corner a massive beast that has absolutely nothing left to lose, You are looking at pure, chaotic danger. The wolves try to surround the giant, but they do not have the explosive energy for a long, drawn-out fight. The moose violently lashes out, wildly swinging its massive, heavy hooves. It is not trying to run away. It is trying to aggressively murder anything that comes within range. The wolves dart in, snap their jaws, and immediately jump back, desperately trying to avoid a lethal blow. The deep snow turns the ravine into a slippery, exhausting wrestling ring. Above the chaos, the ravens are already circling, screaming and calling out into the freezing air. They are placing their bets, completely indifferent to who actually wins. They just know that somebody is going to bleed in the snow very soon. This late winter standoff is the absolute ultimate test of the Alaskan ecosystem. It strips away all the beauty and leaves nothing but pure, unadulterated survival mechanics. The wolves will either drag down the exhausted giant and buy themselves another week of life, or they will calculate the massive risk, realize they are too weak to finish the job, and completely walk away. If they walk away, they might not find another meal in time to survive the freeze. The margin for error has shrunk to absolutely nothing. This is the brutal reality of the Great North. When the land is locked in ice for this long, even the most terrifying apex predators are constantly walking a razor-thin line between life and absolute starvation. You might think that the end of winter is a massive relief for the animals trapped in the Alaskan interior. The sun finally starts hanging in the sky a bit longer, and the brutal 50 below temperatures slowly start to break. But the truth is, the transition into spring is actually one of the absolute most dangerous times of the entire year. We call this the breakup season. The thick, solid ice that covered the rivers and lakes for the last 6 months does not just melt peacefully. It fractures, cracks, and shifts, turning the entire landscape into a massive, unpredictable death trap. Animals that relied on the frozen rivers as safe highways suddenly find themselves walking on literal glass. A full-grown moose will confidently step out onto a familiar river crossing, completely unaware that the ice below has been hollowed out by warmer currents. One wrong step, and the heavy crust shatters loudly. The massive animal plunges straight down into the freezing, fast-moving water below. It is a terrifying, chaotic struggle. The heavy, wet fur drags the moose down, and the jagged edges of the broken ice act like a razor-sharp wall, preventing it from climbing back out. It violently thrashes in the freezing current, burning through its final, desperately low reserves of energy. Most of the time, the river simply pulls them under and carries them away under the dark ice sheet. But out in the wilderness, every single tragedy is an opportunity for somebody else. The river otters, who have spent the entire winter hunting in the pitch-black water beneath the ice, are absolutely thrilled by the breakup season. The cracking ice creates dozens of new breathing holes and escape routes for them. They navigate the dangerous, churning waters with absolute ease, dodging massive chunks of ice that could easily crush a human. They are searching the riverbanks for any victims that the shifting ice has claimed. A drowned moose or a frozen caribou is a massive, unexpected jackpot for a family of otters just trying to rebuild their fat reserves. Meanwhile, deep in the dark, muddy caves dug into the hillsides, the giant sleepers are finally waking up. The grizzly bears. They have been completely shut down for months, surviving entirely off their own slowly depleting body fat. When they finally drag themselves out into the pale sunlight, they are practically starving. A bear in the early spring is not a majestic, playful creature. It is a massive, incredibly irritable engine of pure hunger. They have lost almost a third of their total body weight. Their muscles are stiff, their stomachs are completely empty, and the landscape is still buried under feet of wet, rotting snow. There are no berries, no salmon, and no easy meals waiting for them. These desperate bears are forced to wander the treacherous, melting terrain, relying entirely on their massive noses to sniff out the carcasses of animals that simply did not survive the deep freeze. They will aggressively challenge wolves, eagles, and even other bears over a single frozen ribcage. The arrival of spring does not bring instant salvation. It brings a chaotic, unstable world where the ground literally crumbles beneath your feet. The animals that managed to survive the long, dark winter must now face a brutal obstacle course of rotting ice, flooding rivers, and deeply desperate predators just to reach the summer. As the rotting snow slowly begins to pull back from the southern valleys, the skies above Alaska undergo a massive, noisy transformation. For months, the air has been dead and silent, dominated entirely by the screaming wind and the occasional raven. But now, the silence is violently shattered by the sound of millions of beating wings. The Great Migration is returning. Massive flocks of Canada geese, snow geese, and sandhill cranes are pouring over the mountains, having flown thousands of miles from the southern wintering grounds. They are drawn back to the Arctic by the promise of long daylight hours and the explosive plant growth that is just weeks away. When these massive flocks finally touch down on the melting tundra, the entire ecosystem jolts instantly awake. It is like somebody flipped a massive biological switch. The barren, muddy wetlands are suddenly packed with millions of loud, aggressive birds, claiming nesting territories and fighting fiercely over the best patches of wet grass. But this sudden, explosive influx of life absolutely does not go unnoticed. The local predators have been waiting for this exact moment for half a year. The Arctic foxes, who spent the winter miserably trailing behind polar bears and chewing on frozen scraps, are suddenly surrounded by an overwhelming buffet of fresh meat. A fox will systematically patrol the edge of the massive nesting colonies, moving low to the ground with its ears pinned completely back. They are looking for a distracted goose or an unguarded nest. The geese are large and highly aggressive, easily capable of breaking a fox's jaw with a solid strike from their heavy wings. It becomes a chaotic game of hit and run. The fox darts into the colony, instantly triggering a massive wave of honking, screaming, and flapping wings. It dodges the angry parents, snatches a large egg directly out of the nest, and furiously sprints back to the safety of the rocks. They will do this dozens of times a day, caching the stolen eggs deep in the freezing mud to save for the summer. But the foxes are not the only ones exploiting the arriving flocks. High up on the thermal drafts, scanning the chaotic wetlands below, are the golden eagles. They completely ignore the small eggs. They want the adults. An eagle will fold its massive wings and drop from the sky like a terrifying, silent rock. They target the sick, the exhausted, or the birds that landed just a little too far away from the safety of the main flock. The impact is absolutely devastating. A golden eagle hitting a heavy goose at 100 miles an hour is a brutal display of pure aerial supremacy. The feathers explode into the air, and the hunt is over before the surrounding birds even realize what happened. This explosive return of life completely shifts the balance of power in the north. For the predators, the long, agonizing starvation of winter is finally over, replaced by a massive frenzy of feeding and hoarding. But for the migrating birds, arriving in Alaska is just the beginning of a relentless, deeply exhausting war. They flew across an entire continent just to build their nests in one of the most heavily patrolled, dangerous landscapes on the planet. They must constantly defend their fragile families from the ground, from the sky, and from the unpredictable, freezing storms that still randomly sweep across the melting tundra. By the time June rolls around, the vast interior of Alaska completely changes its identity. The brutal, frozen wasteland melts into millions of acres of shallow, stagnant pools, thick mud, and dense green brush. It looks incredibly lush and vibrant, almost like a massive, sprawling paradise. But anyone who has actually spent time in the deep Alaskan bush during the summer knows the absolute, terrifying truth. This is not a paradise. It is an inescapable, buzzing nightmare. The stagnant water provides the perfect breeding ground for what is arguably the most dangerous, highly effective predator in the entire state: the mosquito. We are not talking about a few annoying bugs at a summer barbecue. We are talking about biological clouds of black flies and mosquitoes so insanely dense that they can actually block out the sun. When the temperature hits a certain point, millions of these tiny vampires hatch simultaneously from the bogs. For the massive herds of caribou that are trying to graze peacefully on the fresh green shoots, this sudden insect explosion is pure, agonizing torture. The swarm aggressively targets their eyes, their noses, and any tiny patch of exposed skin. They breathe the bugs in, coughing and violently shaking their heavy, antlered heads in complete, absolute panic. The harassment is so relentless that it actually changes the physical landscape. Entire herds of caribou are forced to stop eating and start running. They will sprint for miles, desperately seeking out high, windy ridges or leftover patches of hard snow just to get a few minutes of relief from the biting clouds. This frantic, constant movement burns an incredible amount of energy. In a very real way, the mosquitoes dictate the entire migration pattern of the largest land mammals in the north. Young calves that are not strong enough to keep up with the running herd can literally be drained of enough blood to completely collapse in the deep mud. The swarm does not show an ounce of mercy. But this insect-driven chaos provides massive opportunities for the predators lurking in the thick summer brush. The black bear is the undisputed master of this dense, confusing terrain. Unlike the massive grizzlies that dominate the open plains, black bears are smaller, incredibly agile, and perfectly adapted to navigating the thick, tangled forests. They use the chaotic movement of the insect-crazed caribou to their absolute advantage. The massive swarms completely mask the sound of a heavy bear moving through the dry branches. A black bear will sit perfectly still in the deep shadows, completely ignoring the thousands of bites on its own nose, just waiting for an exhausted caribou calf to stumble blindly into the wrong patch of timber. It is a strange, twisted irony of the Alaskan wilderness. The deep winter kills with pure, unfeeling cold, but the brief summer brings a violent, maddening kind of torture that drives massive animals completely insane. The mosquitoes force the massive herds into the waiting jaws of the bears and the wolves, proving that out here absolutely nothing is easy. Even when the sun is shining and the ground is covered in fresh food, the animals are constantly paying a massive, heavy toll just for the right to exist in this wild, unforgiving environment. Way up on the northern edge of the continent, the summer sun absolutely refuses to set. It just circles the horizon endlessly, bathing the Arctic coastline in 24 hours of continuous, harsh daylight. This relentless solar radiation triggers the most dramatic, high-stakes physical transformation on the planet. The massive, solid shelf of pack ice that served as the winter hunting ground for the polar bears begins to violently break apart. Huge, miles-long fractures loudly split the freezing surface, creating dangerous, shifting flows of rotting blue ice. The stable foundation of the Arctic is literally dissolving right into the dark, churning ocean. For the ringed seals, this melting ice is a massive biological relief. They no longer have to maintain tiny, frozen breathing holes. They can haul their heavy bodies out under the floating chunks of ice to rest, molt their fur, and soak in the rare, warm sunlight. But they remain incredibly paranoid. They constantly snap their heads up, scanning the open water and the jagged ice ridges. Because out here, on the shrinking platforms, the polar bears are becoming dangerously desperate. The melting ice is rapidly destroying the bears' absolute only method of hunting. They are massive marine mammals, but they cannot outswim a healthy seal in the open, deep water. A bear has to utilize pure, calculated stealth to get close. They will slip silently into the freezing water completely out of sight, using the floating chunks of ice as visual cover. They swim with just their dark noses above the waterline, slowly closing the distance on a sleeping seal. When the bear reaches the edge of the flow, it completely explodes out of the water in a terrifying display of raw, watery muscle. It uses its heavy front claws to violently slam down on the slippery ice, desperately trying to pin the seal before it can slide off the edge. If the bear is just a fraction of a second too late, the seal dives into the dark depths, leaving the massive predator completely soaked, exhausted, and empty-handed. As the summer wears on, the pack ice retreats further and further away from the Alaskan coastline, moving out into the deep, barren waters of the central Arctic. The bears face a massive, brutal choice. They can either stay on the shrinking ice and risk being stranded hundreds of miles from land, or they can abandon the hunt entirely and swim back to the rocky shore. Those that swim for the coast are forced to spend the rest of the summer practically starving, scrounging for pathetic scraps of washed-up whale blubber or chewing on tough coastal grasses. Their massive bodies slowly waste away under the endless summer sun as they wait for the ocean to freeze again. But while the ice predators suffer, the open water invites a massive influx of marine giants. The bowhead whales arrive, pushing their massive, heavily armored heads straight through the broken, slushy ice. These 60-foot titans live for over 200 years, peacefully filtering millions of tiny crustaceans from the nutrient-rich Arctic waters. They move like slow, ancient submarines through the treacherous ice fields. The crumbling of the winter ice creates a violent, shifting world where the ancient whales finally get to feast, while the undisputed kings of the ice are completely stripped of their power and forced into a long, agonizing period of starvation. If there is one single defining event that completely fuels the massive ecosystem of the Alaskan coast, it is the Great Salmon Run. By late summer, millions upon millions of Pacific salmon leave the deep, dark ocean and begin violently forcing their way up the shallow, rocky freshwater rivers. They are driven by an unstoppable, suicidal biological urge to return to the exact same gravel beds where they were born, just to spawn and immediately die. It is a massive, incredibly chaotic wave of pure protein pushing straight into the heart of the forest. The rivers literally turn red with the sheer density of their bodies, thrashing and fighting against the heavy, rushing currents. The timing of this massive fish invasion is absolutely critical. For the coastal brown bears, this is the main event. They have gathered along the riverbanks by the dozens, abandoning their normal, solitary, highly territorial behavior because the food is just so overwhelmingly abundant. But do not think for a second that it is a peaceful gathering. Massive, 1,000-pound male bears fiercely dominate the absolute best fishing spots, usually right at the base of small waterfalls, where the salmon are literally forced to jump blindly through the air. A young bear that steps out of line or tries to claim a premium spot will be met with terrifying guttural roars and violent, bloody bites to the neck. The fishing techniques are completely brutal and highly efficient. Some bears stand entirely still in the freezing rapids, completely ignoring the roaring water, and snatch the flying fish right out of midair with their massive jaws. Others actively dive into the deep pools, pinning the slippery, heavily muscled fish directly to the rocky bottom with their huge claws. They do not eat the whole fish. They are on a strict, high-fat diet to prepare for winter. They violently rip the skin off, eat the calorie-rich brains and the belly fat, and simply drop the rest of the massive carcass into the mud. The riverbanks look like an absolute chaotic war zone covered in thousands of rotting fish skeletons. This massive, wasteful feast is exactly what the rest of the forest is waiting for. The bald eagles completely abandon their dignified hunting tactics. Hundreds of them gather in the massive spruce trees above the rivers, aggressively diving down to steal the half-eaten scraps right out from under the bears' noses. The gulls, the ravens, and the sneaky river otters all join the massive frenzy. Even the forest itself depends entirely on this chaotic event. The massive amounts of rotting fish drag vital marine nutrients deep into the woods, fertilizing the giant trees and completely changing the chemical makeup of the soil. The salmon basically feed the entire state. But this incredible explosion of life is highly temporary. It is a frantic, desperate race against the massive biological clock ticking in the background. The days are already getting shorter, the night air is getting sharply colder, and the massive run of fish will eventually dry up. The bears must consume tens of thousands of calories a day during this brief window, violently fighting each other for every single bite, because they know exactly what is coming. The brief, chaotic abundance of the Alaskan summer is just a temporary illusion. The dark, freezing hell of winter is always waiting just around the corner, ready to lock the entire landscape back into a brutal, unforgiving silence. As the intense chaos of the summer salmon run finally fades away, the Alaskan air completely changes its texture. You can literally smell the sharp shift in the seasons. The biting mosquitoes are dead, the long days of endless sunlight are shrinking fast, and a sharp, freezing wind starts rolling down heavily from the high mountain peaks. This is late September. The vast tundra turns into a massive, burning ocean of deep red and bright yellow leaves. It looks incredibly beautiful, but for the animals walking through it, this massive color shift is a terrifying, undeniable alarm bell. The brutal biological clock is ticking loudly, and the massive herbivores are about to completely lose their minds. This is the beginning of the rut. The peaceful, solitary lives of the giant bull moose instantly disintegrate into pure chaos. They have spent a brief summer quietly eating deep in the swamps, growing massive sets of heavy antlers that can stretch over 6 feet across and weigh up to 70 pounds. Now, the soft velvet covering those massive antlers aggressively peels off, revealing solid, razor-sharp bone underneath. These massive bulls completely stop eating. They are fueled purely by a terrifying spike in testosterone and an absolute desperate need to pass on their genetics before the freezing winter hits. They violently smash their massive antlers into heavy trees, completely destroying thick branches just to loudly broadcast their raw physical power. The normally quiet boreal forest is suddenly filled with deep, guttural grunts and the terrifying, violent sound of heavy wood snapping in half. When two equally matched, highly aggressive bulls finally cross paths in a remote forest clearing, the entire ecosystem seems to hold its breath. They lower their massive shoulders and charge each other with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. They violently crash those heavy bone crowns together with a sickening, loud crack that literally echoes for miles across the cold valleys. It is a completely brutal, deeply exhausting wrestling match between thousand-pound giants. They tear up the heavy autumn mud, violently twisting their massive necks, desperately trying to throw their heavy rival completely off balance. The sharp, jagged points of the heavy antlers can easily puncture lungs or completely destroy eyes. There are absolutely no rules in this fight. It is only pure, unchecked, violent aggression. The undisputed winner gets the absolute right to mate, and the loser walks away severely exhausted, highly traumatized, and often heavily bleeding. And who exactly do you think is closely watching this chaotic spectacle from the deep shadows of the heavy timber? The gray wolves. The heavy packs are finally highly organized again. Their summer puppies are finally large enough to travel, and they are aggressively hungry. The wolves completely understand the massive physical toll the rut takes on these heavy, aggressive giants. They know absolutely well that the massive bulls are foolishly burning through their vital fat reserves right exactly when they desperately need to be saving them. A massive bull moose that has just lost a brutal, highly exhausting 2-hour fight is completely physically drained and mentally broken. The wolf packs will silently trail these exhausted losers for days, staying just completely out of sight in the heavy brush. They are just patiently waiting for the very first heavy snowfall to trap the weakened giant in a tight canyon. The beautiful autumn colors are just a thin mask hiding a violent frenzy of pure desperation. While the massive giants of the forest are violently fighting over territory, the smaller residents of the Alaskan wilderness are engaged in a completely different kind of absolute madness. They do not have time for heavy battles or aggressive posturing. They are in a pure, blind panic to hoard as much food as physically possible before the deep snow permanently buries the ground. Up in the jagged, highly exposed rock slides of the massive mountain ranges, the American pika is working on absolute overdrive. These tiny, incredibly cute animals look like small rabbits with rounded ears, but they possess an absolutely terrifying work ethic. They do not hibernate at all. They have to stay completely awake and fully active deep under the heavy snow for up to 8 miserable months. To survive that incredible stretch of freezing darkness, a single tiny pika has to build a massive, highly organized hay pile inside the dark cracks of the heavy rocks. They frantically run out into the dying alpine meadows, desperately clipping off hundreds of different types of flowers and tough grasses. They gather so much heavy vegetation in their tiny mouths that they look like they possess massive, green mustaches. They do not just randomly throw the grass into a pile, they carefully spread it out on the sun-baked rocks to properly dry, creating highly nutritious, perfectly cured hay. If they dragged wet green grass into their caves, it would immediately rot and they would simply starve to death in January. They make thousands of desperate trips a day, constantly aggressively watching the freezing sky for golden eagles. Down in the heavy boreal timber, the frantic hoarding game is just as aggressively intense. The red squirrels are completely losing their tiny minds. They are fiercely territorial, loud, and incredibly angry all the time. A red squirrel spends the entire brief autumn aggressively cutting heavy pine cones out of the massive spruce trees. They drop thousands of sticky cones directly onto the forest floor and then frantically bury them in massive underground caches called middens. These middens are absolutely sacred to the squirrel. They are heavily guarded, multi-generational treasure chests of pure biological fuel. A desperate squirrel will absolutely violently attack another squirrel that even looks at its hidden winter stash. It is a highly stressful, constantly paranoid existence, built entirely around hiding and defending tiny frozen seeds. But nobody in the entire Alaskan ecosystem takes autumn eating more seriously than the massive grizzly bears. They are currently in a bizarre biological state called hyperphagia. This basically means their massive brains have completely shut down the biological signal that tells them they are full. They are physically incapable of feeling full. A massive grizzly bear will furiously consume up to 20,000 calories every single day right now. They are aggressively vacuuming up thousands of freezing berries, ripping apart heavy rotten logs to eat tiny frozen ants, and constantly scavenging for dead animals. They move through the dying autumn landscape like massive, unstoppable vacuum cleaners. They desperately need to pack on hundreds of pounds of solid brown fat, or they will simply never wake up from their deep winter sleep. The entire state is locked in a frantic race to stockpile calories before the freezing sky falls. For a massive portion of the Alaskan wildlife, staying to aggressively fight the freezing winter is absolutely out of the question. It is simply biological suicide. The only viable option for survival is a massive, highly coordinated retreat. As the heavy lakes start to freeze around the shallow edges and the freezing wind begins to howl continuously, the skies completely fill up once again. But this time, the massive traffic is all heading firmly in one single direction: south. The Great Autumn Migration is an incredibly desperate race against the rapidly advancing ice. Millions of massive birds that nested here during the brief, chaotic summer are now abandoning the freezing state completely en masse. The absolute undisputed champion of this massive exodus is the Arctic tern. This delicate, incredibly light white bird weighs barely a few ounces, but it is about to embark on the longest, most terrifying physical journey of any animal on the entire planet. They are leaving the jagged, freezing coastlines of Alaska and flying all the way to the absolute bottom of the Earth, heading straight for Antarctica. It is a mind-blowing, brutal trip of over 40,000 miles round trip every single year. They practically live in a constant state of endless summer, chasing the continuous daylight from one extreme pole directly to the other. They must aggressively dodge massive, violent oceanic storms, deeply exhausted and constantly scanning the open, dark water for tiny silver fish to fuel their incredible, relentless flight. Meanwhile, high above the massive, snow-capped peaks of the interior, a deeply haunting, prehistoric sound echoes loudly through the freezing clouds. The sandhill cranes are gathering. Thousands of these incredibly tall, elegant birds spiral upwards on the very last warm thermal drafts of the dying year. They circle higher and higher, calling out to each other constantly to maintain a tight, highly organized formation. They must absolutely gain enough massive altitude to safely clear the jagged, highly dangerous mountain ranges before the first massive blizzard hits. If a flock of cranes gets violently caught in a heavy, freezing downdraft over the mountains, they will be completely smashed against the hard rocks. They fly in absolute perfect unison, a massive, moving arrow of gray feathers pointing directly away from the rapidly encroaching death of the deep northern winter. And this massive retreat is absolutely not just happening in the freezing sky. Down in the dark, heavy waters of the freezing Arctic Ocean, the white ghosts of the sea are aggressively on the move, the beluga whales. These incredibly vocal, highly social marine mammals have spent the brief summer feeding heavily in the shallow, muddy river deltas. But the shallow water is incredibly dangerous right now. The surface of the ocean is literally freezing solid behind them. If the belugas wait just a few days too long, the thick, heavy pack ice will violently lock them inside the shallow bays, completely cutting off their absolute only path to open water. They would slowly suffocate under the crushing ice. So, the pods aggressively push southward in massive, highly coordinated groups. They communicate constantly with a bizarre, high-pitched symphony of clicks and loud whistles, desperately racing ahead of the violently advancing freeze. The Great North is rapidly emptying out, completely shedding millions of lives just before the massive freezer door slams violently shut. Then, the massive, inevitable transition finally happens. It usually starts with a strange, incredibly heavy silence dropping completely over the boreal forest. The violent wind suddenly completely stops, the sharp temperature dramatically plummets, and the dark gray sky physically lowers itself like a massive, heavy blanket. The very first real snow of the season does not just lightly fall. It aggressively, violently dumps feet of heavy, wet powder onto the deeply exhausted landscape in a matter of hours. The vibrant red and yellow colors of the brief autumn are instantly, violently erased, completely replaced by an endless, blinding ocean of pure white. For the animals that stubbornly stayed behind, this is the absolute final reality check. There is no escaping it now. The brutal Alaskan winter has officially arrived. High up on the terrifying, jagged peaks of the massive mountain ranges, the Dall sheep just silently stand and take the brutal hit. Their pure white coats instantly blend into the freshly fallen snow, essentially turning them into completely invisible ghosts clinging desperately to the steep cliffs. They know exactly what this massive snow dump means. It means their pathetic, low-calorie food supply is now heavily buried under a massive layer of frozen water. They must immediately begin violently pawing at the icy rocks with their incredibly sharp hooves, burning massive amounts of precious calories just to find a few dry, frozen pieces of dead grass. They are already standing directly on the razor-thin edge of absolute starvation, and the season has literally only just begun. The mountains are completely unforgiving, offering absolutely zero physical shelter from the freezing storms. But down in the massive frozen valleys, one specific creature is absolutely thriving in the sudden blinding chaos of the first blizzard, the Wolverine. While every other animal is frantically seeking shelter, completely terrified of the rapidly dropping temperatures, the Wolverine is actively hunting. The fresh, deep snow is their absolute greatest tactical advantage. Their incredibly wide, heavily furred paws act like biological snowshoes, allowing them to sprint effortlessly right over the top of the soft, deep powder. They know that larger, heavier animals like the young caribou or the exhausted moose are going to aggressively struggle and heavily flounder in the deep drifts. The Wolverine uses the massive snowstorm as a perfect, silent cover, moving like a dark, aggressive shadow through the blinding whiteout, desperately looking for anyone foolish enough to panic and get stuck in the heavy drifts. And hiding directly beneath the massive snowdrifts, a completely brilliant biological magic trick is already taking place. The willow ptarmigan, a plump, heavily feathered Arctic bird, completely embraces the freezing snow. They do not run away from the massive storm. They actively dive directly headfirst into the soft, deep powder. They violently burrow deep down, creating small, perfectly insulated snow caves just a few inches below the freezing surface. The snow completely blocks out the screaming, violent wind, keeping their tiny bodies just warm enough to survive the brutal night. They will sit perfectly still in total darkness, completely hidden from the golden eagles and the aggressive foxes desperately searching the surface above. The first heavy snow brings absolute violent death to the weak. But for the highly specialized, ancient survivors of the North, it is just the harsh, familiar beginning of a very long, very dark waiting game. By the time the massive darkness of late November aggressively swallows the entire Arctic coastline, the brutal, unforgiving circle of the Alaskan ecosystem completely closes itself once again. The massive open ocean that briefly thrived with ancient whales and frantic diving birds is completely gone. It has been violently replaced by millions of square miles of solid, grinding pack ice. And right exactly at the jagged, frozen edge of the massive continent, the absolute undisputed king finally returns to reclaim his frozen throne. The polar bear has survived the agonizing, highly miserable starvation of the brief summer. They have lost massive amounts of weight, wandering the muddy shores like deeply exhausted, angry ghosts. But now, the ice is finally hard enough to easily hold their massive, heavy bodies. They step boldly out onto the violently shifting, loudly cracking ice floes, pointing their massive black noses directly into the freezing, howling wind. The scent of ringed seals is finally wafting heavily through the freezing air again. The long, agonizing fast is completely over, and the brutal, deeply patient hunt immediately resumes. And following completely obediently, just a few hundred yards behind the massive bear's heavy tracks, is the tiny, pure white Arctic fox. The fox knows perfectly well that it absolutely cannot survive the brutal winter by itself. It completely ties its own violent fate directly to the massive, heavy violence of the giant bear, desperately hoping to quietly steal a few bloody scraps of frozen blubber in the dark, freezing night. Further inland, completely exposed on the flat, wind-blasted tundra, the massive prehistoric musk oxen are standing perfectly still. The temperature has plummeted completely off the charts, sitting at an agonizing 60 degrees below zero. The wind is actively screaming, violently hurling sharp, jagged ice crystals directly into their heavy, armored faces. But they absolutely do not move. They do not desperately run for cover because there simply is no cover. They just lower their massive, heavy heads, aggressively lock their heavy shoulders firmly together, and completely endure. They are the absolute perfect, heavy embodiment of the great northern wilderness. They are built entirely out of pure biological defiance. They have stood in this exact same freezing, brutal formation for tens of thousands of years, completely ignoring the violent rage of the Arctic winter. This is the absolute, terrifying reality of the Alaskan wilderness. It is an incredibly massive, deeply violent, perfectly balanced machine powered entirely by pure desperation and absolute endurance. There is absolutely no mercy anywhere out here. The heavy snow relentlessly buries the weak, the violent freezing wind rapidly steals the heat from the exhausted, and the aggressive, hungry shadows are constantly, endlessly hunting in the dark. The animals that survive in this brutal, frozen hell do not just exist here. They actively wage an endless, violent war against the freezing elements every single day of their lives. The short, chaotic explosion of the brief summer is completely gone, violently erased by the heavy ice. The great dark freeze has completely taken over once again, plunging this incredibly harsh, beautiful, and deeply unforgiving world directly back into the massive, freezing silence of the deep winter. The North American wilderness is absolutely never just a static, peaceful postcard. It is a constantly shifting, violently unforgiving arena where every single changing season brings a completely new, terrifying method of absolute survival. The freezing hell of Alaska completely proves that life does not just passively exist in comfortable, easy spaces. It actively fights, heavily bleeds, and brilliantly adapts to the absolute most hostile, terrifying extremes found anywhere on this planet. The massive, brutal circle of the seasons out here is totally relentless, constantly testing the absolute physical and mental limits of every single creature, from the tiniest frozen caterpillar buried in the deep mud to the largest, heaviest roaming bear aggressively walking the shifting sea ice. The deep, heavy ice will eventually melt again, the frantic, chaotic biological cycle will violently restart, and the ancient, brutal dance of predator and prey will just keep moving aggressively forward into the future. Thank you for completely braving the freezing cold and deeply exploring this incredible, harsh, and utterly beautiful world with me. Stay wild, stay completely curious, and I will see you out there in the next massive deep dive.